I'm Bryn. That was Toon who just spoke. Welcome to this week's SmartDB Office Hours session. And true to form, we propose starting with a little bit of a sort of expository session from Toon. So I hope everyone can see Toon's slides, and off you go, Toon.
Yeah, so I think it was 2 weeks ago that we were struggling about a theme for today's office hour. And then a couple of days ago, there was this Twitter thread going on about APIs and the SmartDB paradigm, specifically table APIs, transactional APIs, business function APIs, etc., etc. So I thought I would put down some of my thoughts on it, because I specifically did not join that Twitter thread when it was going on. So I'll share some of my thoughts in this area, and then we can, I think we can have a discussion later on. This is a slide deck of 18 slides, so it should be done within 20 minutes or so. So here goes. Now, again, I always start with what's the context of SmartDB. The context of SmartDB is an application, typically an OLTP application, talking to an Oracle database. Now, one of the comments in the thread was, or I think it was somewhere else, that, well, often today's applications, they are polyglot. They use storage not only in an Oracle database, but many other databases. Well, in that case, we simply suggest that the Oracle storage part of your application is done using SmartDB. Yeah? Since we're both from Oracle, we talk about the Oracle storage part and how to deal with that in a manner that makes it all good in lots of ways that I'll just mention in a minute. Yeah, so polyglot storage, okay, fine by us. The Oracle storage is done using SmartDB. Now, the most important property of the SmartDB paradigm is what we have put up here, and that is the outside world, the programming language, the tool, or whatever do you have outside of the database. I have an echo now. Somebody needs to unmute himself. Has credentials of an empty connect schema. And this connect schema into the database can only call API objects. And the API objects are stored PL/SQL modules. This is the essence, the most important property of the SmartDB. Yeah, so when I say do the Oracle storage using SmartDB, we mean that you should not expose the internals of the database design, of the guts inside the database, to the outside world. You only expose these API objects. Now, this gives you a separation of concerns. And it was actually a major lesson from the 90s, where we produced unmaintainable applications. And I have a bit more to say about that in a few slides from here. But visually, you have user interfaces outside. They connect into an empty schema. This empty schema can only call API objects that are further down in the Oracle realm, in the Oracle database realm. There are other schemas here that deal with all the stuff that needs to be done for the API call to be serviced. Now, from this, it follows that no SQL texts live in the outside world. It simply follows from this most important property of SmartDB. All SQL is submitted inside the database via PL/SQL, and it's handwritten by database developers or generated by database developers. And I'm referring to TAPIs here, which will become clear in a minute. Now, what we have learned in the 90s is this enables agility. You can evolve the database design at your heart's desire, as long as the APIs can remain stable. This means you don't have an impact into the outside world. You can make changes, you can make improvements inside whatever you need to do inside the database. You can even refactor whole bits. EBR is a wonderful technology that can aid you in getting this done without, again, having the impact in the outside world, as long as the APIs remain the same. And we claim the benefits are, and some of these I have personally witnessed during my career, you'll end up with an application that's easier to maintain. By the way, performance might also benefit. Of course, I've spoken in length about that during other sessions in the YouTube movies that are out there. Bryn specifically mentions and focuses on the security aspect. You can make these applications really, really secure. And another thing that I often say is you get agility. And what I mean by that is you can easily move on to a new technology in the user interface technology space, because that's where technologies change every year, every 2 years, maybe even every less than a year. Why do you get agility? Because the guts of your applications aren't implemented in these technologies. They are implemented further down in the stable Oracle technology stack, so that you can gain agility. You can easily move from one JavaScript framework to another JavaScript framework. And 10 years ago, I would have said from one Java framework to another Java framework. Now, there are other properties when we talk about SmartDB, but the main property is this empty schema that can only do API calls. Yeah. The other properties have to do with how do you then organize everything that you have to build within the database, all this PL SQL and the tables and the views, etc. And as the other properties we deal with, or Bryn specifically deals with in his hard shell paper. And again, security is a main dimension of that, a main driver of the architecture that Bryn explains in that paper in terms of schema setup and using various features in Oracle 12 and onwards to make it all very highly secure. And I talk specifically about how to deal with setting up this in a slightly different way in my part 2 bit of this no PL SQL versus SmartDB talk, which is also out there on YouTube. I talk about business logic, data logic, shared components, etc., etc. Yeah, but we leave a bit of freedom in here, as far as at least I'm concerned, and I think you agree with me, Bryn, on this.
Yes, I do.
Yeah, one of the things that we both agree on very specifically is that you usually end up introducing multiple schemas to separate concerns inside the database, to make it all, to create overview of everything that you design and build inside the database.
If I can just interrupt there with a tiny point, the subdivision or the classification of your various different kinds of artifacts into different schemas has benefits at patching time, in the sense that anyone making some changes in one schema who authorizes to connect to that schema obviously has a limited scope of action. And that's just a general good rule, isn't it? Always operate in a domain of minimum privilege.
Yeah. Now, notice that I've always been talking about the other technologies outside the database, which a main technology that you always have when you build these OLTP applications is the technology that you use to create the user interfaces with. Now, let's move on to Apex, because Apex always comes into this discussion. And I know there are people out there with Apex trying to consider doing SmartDB, etc. The thing about Apex is, well, it's not outside the database, right? It sits inside the database. You have this Apex engine inside the database. And I've specifically positioned it here underneath an empty schema. Because in some way, you can say that Apex already conforms to that most important property that we just mentioned. Yeah. Because how do you get to Apex? Well, there is only one function exposed via ODS. It's that F function. Actually, it's a procedure. That's the little bit that starts every Apex URL. F is a procedure into the Apex engine, and everything from the browser via ODS comes into the database via F. And F is executable by this empty schema that ODS is using, typically Apex public user or something else that you've configured. Yeah? And within Apex, you are able to configure more entry points into the database. But out of the box, you have function F. Yeah? So to me, Apex in a funny way already conforms to the most important property. The database is closed, it's only one entry point, that's F, the main function of the Apex UI engine. However, I have issues with Apex because I think history is repeating itself right now. In the 90s, we had this very hugely popular development environment called Oracle Forms, SQL Forms. And SQL Forms was a client tool. it had a client-side PL/SQL engine, and we had PL/SQL in the database. I'm using an old slide here that I presented, I think it was 14 years ago at ODTUG. And what was very easy to do in the 90s was that you were mixing your application and your business logic code across these two PL/SQL engines. You have stuff inside forms, you had stuff inside stored procedures and the database. And it was very easy to do that. There was a seamless integration, and typically there was just one person doing the job. One person was building the UI, and also when it was convenient, did some stored PL/SQL packages or functions or views or whatever you inside the database. Yeah? But this created a maintenance nightmare because logic was all over the place. It was in the client, it was in the database, and it wasn't very clear. There weren't much guidelines in that area, which brought us later in the 90s to prevent putting logic in the PL/SQL engine of forms and push everything downwards. Yeah, this was sort of like the origin of this whole SmartDB thinking. How can we make this more maintainable? And with Apex, I see history repeating itself. In the sense that, well, Apex, it doesn't have its own PL/SQL engine. No, it's PL/SQL already, and it runs inside the PL/SQL engine of the database. But within Apex, you're able to, at many, many places inside Apex, introduce anonymous PL/SQL blocks. With a processing, how do you call it? Process action, or within pre-header triggers or whatever. There's very many places in Apex where you can put an anonymous PL/SQL block. So you get the same kind of thing happening with Apex again. Although it conforms to our main property, Apex, again, since it's typically the same person doing the UI and all the logic further downwards, because it's PL/SQL, which is the capability that this person needs to have, it invites you to mix everything across these two tiers as I've depicted them here in this picture. Yeah. So the risk of creating unmaintainable applications with Apex, I consider very high. And I think there are already Apex applications out there that are very hard to maintain by people who have not authored these applications. So that's my issue with Apex. That's a comment on Apex. Now, going back to the API discussion on the Twitter thread. At some point, I think it was you, Bryn, that said, okay, so we'll have transactional business function APIs. Let's call them XAPIs. These typically involve multiple tables. You want some business transaction done inside the database. It nearly always involves multiple tables. If not just write, typically also reads.
Yeah, can I say something there very briefly,
Toon?
Just that, as I recall history, it was dear old Tom Kite who introduced this XAPI or ZAPI term into the vocabulary. That's one thing. The other thing is, I don't think we need the word typical to give weight to this point. Rather, we always just must consider the general case. And certainly it happens that these business transactions affect more than one table. So we have to have a general stance to that from the get-go.
Yeah. So these business function APIs, be them write or just read, they have multiple table involvement. And then we have this concept called table APIs, which originates also from the 90s and which typically get created using simple generators that are written in PL/SQL also. And they are at least this is how I recall them. They were used to support CRUD operations per table. Yeah. So you generate a TAPI package, a table API package for each table, and that package would have an insert procedure, an update, a delete procedure, and many other procedures depending on what your business logic required. Now, position-wise, TAPIs live underneath here. They live under the APIs and the business function level APIs. So for me, it's fine to use TAPIs if you think they save you time in developing a SmartDB architected application, as long as they are not exposed to the user interface. That to me would be a bridge too far. You have business APIs, business function APIs, and further down, sure, go ahead, use TAPIs. Use TAPIs to prevent code duplication or to more quickly generate all kinds of code modules that you want to reuse on layers further up.
Can I just interrupt with one tiny thing, Toon?
Mm-hmm.
With respect to that huge Twitter exchange on June the 14th and my perhaps over-emotional opposition to TAPIs in whatever 280 characters allow, I was kind of thinking back to dear old Tom, and Tom's assumption was what Toon was talking about now, the other way around, that people who were thinking of these TAPIs and using that word were thinking that they would form the database API to the client. And I, of course, didn't explain all that in my short form tweets, but Toon has explained it now.
Okay, thank you. Now, the issue with UI tools, here's the issue with UI tools. Most UI technologies, most UI tools, they have been designed from the ground up to issue SQL. Just look at Oracle Forms in the 90s. It wants to issue SQL on base table blocks. Look at ADF, or in particular ADF business components. It generates SQL. It generates SQL to get things done. Apex. All kinds of default features inside Apex to quickly, using wizards, generate query screens or CRUD screens. They want to do SQL. And lately, with all this RESTful paradigm, with its get, put, post, and delete mechanisms, REST also wants to do SQL. It wants to put a row, it wants to get a row, it wants to update a row, it wants to delete a row. I think post is insert, put is update. I always mix the two up. Yeah, so these technologies assume that the majority of your screens in your OLTP applications are CRUD screens. Now here comes the debate, I think. In my opinion, in my personal experience, yes, you have CRUD screens, but they are not the majority. Or let me rephrase, they might be the majority, but they are CRUD screens on top of configuration data, on top of reference data. These are typically screens that are, whose frequency in using them is low. The screens that are used a lot in your applications are not CRUD screens. They are much more sophisticated screens. Yeah. And this is even less true, CRUD screens being the main thing in your applications, in the new era, where we all have an iPhone or an iPad and apps with which we can do transactions further in the back on some database. Yeah, an app doesn't offer you a CRUD screen. Yeah, but the UI tools, and they still are, they are designed to issue SQL. So forcing SmartDB for these UI tools is potentially counterproductive. I have to acknowledge that, right? Because it's so easy for, especially Apex also, to, when you need a CRUD screen, just use the out-of-the-box functionality of Apex, because it is generating inserts, updates, deletes, and selects for free. But you're then violating the most important property of SmartDB. You are not going into the database through a predefined business function API. That's the point that I just want to make. Yeah. But again, I acknowledge tooling out there sometimes force you just to remain productive, to deviate from our main property that we would like to have in our application. Now, to give you an example of a business function API, here I've also, and I cut and paste, these are slides again from 14 years ago on a different ODTUC presentation that I did. I just want to put a spade in the ground. When I say business function API, here's an example of a business function API. Now I'm gonna have to explain to you two tables, and you're all very familiar with these two tables. And I'm also going to tell you a little bit of the business rules around these two tables. Yeah? So we have an employee table. Every employee works in a department. We have departments. Every department has a manager. That's the foreign key back. So a department also, that's maybe something you are not used to in the standard department table. Yeah, and there's this rule called a department that employs the president or a manager should also employ an administrator. Just let this be a rule in the application that we want to build. And number three, I also want to do number three here. The department manager, so the foreign key going back to the employee, must point to an employee who's actually working in that department. right? That's another rule. Now let's look at the business function. Create a new department. That could be a business function. I would have a screen that enables the user to introduce a new department in my business. Yeah. So inserting a new department, including the new department manager, because I have this chicken egg issue going on here. If I insert the department, I also have to include the manager of this department. Yeah. And possibly, if it's a manager, I'm going to assume it's not the president. If it's a manager, also introduce an administrator in this department, because that was a business rule. The department that employs the president or a manager must also employ an administrator. So let that be a business rule. So then, looking at what I possibly would need to do to get this business function done is I would have to insert the department. I would have to insert the manager of the department. And if that's actually whose job is a manager, then I would also have to insert a second employee, an administrator, all in one go, because these are business rules and I want to adhere to all the business rules. Transactions should not leave the database in a state that doesn't adhere to business rules. Yeah, so if you now look at all the columns in these tables, I've put circles around what the user needs to input. And all the rest can be derived. I'm going to derive depno from a sequence. I'm going to derive empno from a sequence. That's also going to act as a value for this foreign key back here in the department. Hired is just going to default to sysdate. This depno is going to default to the sequence that I drew here. And possibly I'm going to do a next val again for the second employee, hired again. This job is predefined. It has to be admin. So I'm not going to ask the user to input that. And this depno is also predefined. Yeah? So if you look at this business function, I'm inserting 3 rows, but the user needs to supply 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 column values. Yeah? So business function wise, it would present a screen to the user with 9 fields. Give me these 9 fields, supply them to a stored procedure, and the stored procedure then does all the logic. That to me is a business function. Yeah, and that would be a transactional API exposed to the outside world, where we have the user interface that would call into the database to get creating a new department, including the manager and possibly also an administrator done. Yeah, and this is again, this was 12 years ago, so we would issue an XML message. We would input an XML message into a stored procedure. Nowadays, you just input a JSON instance into a stored procedure and then do everything behind the hard shell in the JSON, in the PL SQL layer. And with that, that's basically some of the eggs that I wanted to lay out there for now.
Let me make a little comment immediately, Toon. I've seen that scenario, or let's say the class of scenario that discussion illustrated, turned on its head by the pressure of the tools that are at hand to do CRUD. So the business rules have been thrown out of the window to allow a department with nothing in it yet in some sort of provisional state. In other words, to allow departures from what would have been the business rule exactly to make the UI work. And then that has to be backed up with some kind of periodic batch-like patrolling to find then these things that violate what would have been transactionally enforced rules. We see that to some extent with all these cheap and cheerful applications that we have to use in connection with, for example, conference participation. Maybe I'm extending the analogy a bit far there when I say that, but I think you know what I mean. In other words, I've seen, and I expect you all have, examples where the capabilities of the UI tool drive the whole thinking about the data model and the data rules, which does seem to be exactly putting the cart before the horse. And in the SmartDB paradigm, we're encouraging you to think exactly in the opposite way.
Yeah. So let me backtrack to the Apex screen, because there's one point that I now want to make. So you could have an Apex screen built inside Apex that does this business function that I just talked about. Yeah. So it would call a stored procedure and then insert the department and possibly 2 employees. So even with Apex already being inside the database, you could still, I would advise you to, for transactional APIs of this kind that are not obviously simple CRUD type of business functions, to do it in a way as I just described. Because can you imagine how easy it now would be to migrate that screen into Oracle Jet, to remove it from Apex and create an Oracle Jet screen that does the exact same thing? Yeah. Somebody who's proficient in Oracle Jet can probably paint a screen with 9 fields within an hour. Can probably put all the code in or ODS to configure, put all the code into the control bits of the Jet screen to, whenever a save button is hit, call that stored procedure, and you're fully reusing all the logic inside PL SQL. So that's coming back to what I just mentioned. You become agile in adopting this most volatile part of your application, which is the front-end user technology. Now, had you had all this logic inside Apex, you would have had to redo all the logic inside Jet, or at that point move it to PL SQL had you so chosen to do. So it's awfully quiet.
Yes, well, shall we?
Are there any comments?
We haven't invited people now, and let's see if it works. If anyone would like to comment on this or put a question, let's just see if it works. If you unmute yourself and just speak it out. Let's try that now. And if no one says anything, I will name some names.
With those things that are in the chat.
Who's that speaking? Is that Kim?
Kim, yes, I'm speaking. There's already someone who has written different things in the chat. It would be fair to answer their questions first, those who are already typing.
Oh, I see. I thought you said jet. You said chat. Yes. Well, okay then. Sorry. Fair enough. I will stand corrected on that point. So I'm skimming down the questions now. And here is one from Dennis. And it says, is it okay to enable REST using ORDs on this empty connect schema? Or should it be a different layer of abstraction? I'm not entirely sure what the question means, but in this particular, let's say, subflavor of SmartDB, where we're very much thinking of a REST-style communication to the database, I, for various reasons, prefer to call that HTTP over, sorry, RPC, remote procedure call over HTTP, but never mind that. Let's just call it REST to save breath now. So, sorry, that was a little bit of a chaotic sentence. The general paradigm where the database is the endpoints of the REST, in other words, the APIs in question are exactly JSON, well, text in, text out functions where the semantics of the text is JSON. In that refinement of the paradigm, how do you make it all work? Well, we still have our empty connect schema, exactly as discussed, or more carefully, a family of empty connect schemas, if that suits our purposes. And by the way, various other clients, conceivably even a remote database using a database link, could compose and unscramble JSON and use that API. But the case we expect is where ORDS is there and where there'll be something like Oracle Jet at the other end of it. Well, then in that case, we are exactly enabling REST to operate on that empty schema. So in a sense, that's the answer to the question, I believe.
Yeah, I'm a little bit puzzled by the or should it be a different layer of abstraction? But it's exactly as you say, we enable REST on the empty connect schema. Typically, I think if you are using Oracle Jet, that would be the way to go. Yeah, you enable REST on the Oracle Connect schema, and the Oracle Connect schema can execute the API calls. So then within REST, you configure all these API calls so that you can call them from Oracle Jet using HTTP calls from the browser towards the RDS layer.
Yes. I'll just add some little subtle comment there, because when we hear the phrase REST enabling, particularly from the advocates of that particular bit of the development shop within Oracle, it always seems to imply REST enabling a set of tables, the thing that Toon referred to earlier on. In other words, this whole paradigm that invites exposing the tables and, loosely speaking, doing SQL. And as you all know out there, I'm sure the mechanisms of ORDS include schemes that will compose SQL against tables. And I, at least, I'll speak for myself now and then let Toon comment, in this hard shell talk of mine, advocate using a tiny subset of the ORDS functionality and owning the whole JSONification and translation of it inside the database. And that's a sort of philosophical point. I take the stance that this API contract, expressed as the set of functions in question, what they're called, and what the JSON in and out is all about, that contract has been very carefully negotiated between the UI people and the database people, and it's the responsibility of course, both sides, but now thinking of the database, it's the responsibility of the database to do it right. And as I always say in my talks, responsibility needs authority. And the only way you can get the authority to do the right thing with all the JSON is to do it inside the database. And there are plenty of facilities in the database for doing that in a relatively painless fashion. And with successive releases, it'll get more and more declarative. So in our, or at least the paradigm I was advocating as a subset of the general SmartDB paradigm in that hard shell talk, there I'm suggesting that the ORDS is used for nothing more than a completely semantics-free protocol translator that goes from RPC over HTTP to the corresponding Oracle net invocation of a PL SQL procedure. If that seems a little bit off topic, forgive me, but I think it speaks to the general theme of the question. But just tell me, Dennis, yes or no, do you feel that your question has been answered now? 3, 2, 1. In that case, let's just say we've done that one and we'll move on. There's one from Peter Nosko here then. Hello, Peter. I still haven't heard your voice, but we've typed a lot to each other. Please give some cases sorry, I'm going to translate this into a typo. Please give some use case examples of XAPIs from the Oracle internal apps for which we hear performance metrics on Twitter. Well, I was duty bound to read it out, but I don't think we can do that kind of thing. I think that Toon's example with the admittedly XML formulation that you could translate to JSON, but underlying it, it was just the philosophical thing of getting formal parameters who represent what needs to be done. I think we've already addressed that. What do you think, Toon?
Yeah, again, I'm not sure. Did we ever claim Oracle internal apps and performance metrics for them? Well, certainly I didn't on Twitter. No, so I can't give you examples.
Nor me. I think people were asking about that, hoping that we would. But, you know, we can't comment on that. It's as simple as that. So moving on then, and here's a comment from Judith. Oracle forms can also be used so that they only call server-side PL SQL for performing any SQL. But I don't think this is what people normally do, paraphrasing slightly.
Yeah, and, which is the next comment exactly. Forms
yes.
Uses, yeah,
so precisely, I don't think we need to address that further. And then here, I guess this is from Eric van Roon in the Netherlands, and it says, can you discuss your last slide? I assume, Eric, you mean the last slide that Toon showed a bit more. It sounded like you were suggesting passing many parameters to a function as a JSON object, but it went by very quickly.
Wait, where are you now? That's Eric van Roon.
Sorry, Bryn, but I didn't send a message, so it must be somebody else's.
Oh, okay. Well, a different Eric then in that case. I'm not quite sure then, again, these questions when they're typed up. Sorry to contradict you, Kim, but I was hoping to avoid this, but I thought I'd better honor the typed questions. The typed questions where you don't get a chance to sort of feedback in the moment to get the inner meaning of them are hard to deal with. I would just say here that as I'm going to reinterpret what Toon said and hope that it comes off as clear as it seemed to me what Toon said in the first place, that is that in general, a business function is parameterized by a number of quantities, typically a number of scalars, but not necessarily so. And that in our paradigm, we are proposing that we pass all those actual values that parameterize the present operation in one go. If it were an ordinary PL/SQL parameterization, then it would be a procedure with a whole list of formal parameters. But when we put the JSON around it, then of course, it's the nature of JSON that a JSON document represents a compound value, as compound as you would like. So we're just doing a semantics-free representation translation from what would be conventionally a set of formal parameters in the parameterization of the PL/SQL procedure to a single formal of type text in a PL/SQL function where the information content in both cases is the same. Did that sound clear, Toon? Or did it come out muddled?
I was reading Dennis's reply to my clarification question.
Oh, right. Oh, yeah, because you missed what I said. Well, I'm going to assert that what I said was clear enough. In other words, this question that I just read out, I don't get any more detail from that. So, you know what? This is where, Kim, with the greatest respect, I'm going to overrule you because the typed questions are getting a bit out of hand and hard to digest. Philip, are you out there? Philip Salvesborg from Switzerland.
Yes, I'm here.
Yes. Can I ask you to elaborate on your concerns? I think we seem to have a strange difference of opinion, and I'm not sure that I ever got to the bottom of it.
Yes, I guess we have different opinions on various topics, but the topic today is TAPIs and other things. So maybe I can elaborate a bit about the TAPI topic only. And I very much agree what Toon said before. So the question is how you deal with the TAPI and whether you're going to expose the TAPI directly to the Connect user or not. Mm-hmm. And that's the question. And I responded on Twitter to your tweets regarding TAPIs to be evil without having a context. So I have use cases where TAPIs are a good thing and even used within XAPI. So it's perfectly okay. So what I'm going to use also in new applications is TAPIs for functionality which is missing in the Oracle database. And I've pointed out one example is the temporal validity, which is incomplete since it was introduced. And if you want to do an operation which is just insert the period, which might require to update your period, insert the new record, and update a succeeding period, is 3 operations. And what I want to do is to put that logic into a TAPI. It's just a table API. It's dealing with functionality which is not available in the database itself. And from my point of view, it's perfectly okay to use that in that purpose. And we have a lot of examples in that area. So just ruling out the use of TAPI is just a bad advice. That's my opinion. That's it.
Right. And I apologize if I gave the wrong kind of knee-jerk reaction by saying TAPIs are evil. Now I hope everyone out there understands my context. But tell me, Philip, when you say TAPI, does it imply for you that it's generated, or does it imply just a certain level of encapsulation within your whole structure of code?
The latter.
The latter, yes. Yes, exactly. And in a loose sense then, you might even say that an additioning view is a TAPI. I know it's slightly forcing the analogy, but in that case, it's good that we've separated generation as a notion from TAPI as a notion. You did have another thing. You were forcing me, if you like, on this definition of SmartDB, and wondering, other people wondered, it was Peter Nosko wondered if we might allow views in our definition. I believe that Toon in today's talk made all that crystal clear. So let me first ask you, Philip, are you clear on how we want to use the word SmartDB? It doesn't mean that everything on the planet is SmartDB, or possibly even that everything on the planet should be SmartDB, but nevertheless, we want a clear definition of what we mean by it, and we see many use cases where it's a good thing to do. So are you clear on that now, Philip?
It's your definition of SmartDB, so yes. I have to live with it.
Good, but by all means, make your own definition for something else. And Peter Nosko, are you clear on what we intend now when we talk about SmartDB and how it have a definition?
I think so. I dropped out of this some bad.
Sorry, your audio is cracking up. We're not getting what you're saying.
Connection. So views was a no, right?
Yes. Within our definition of SmartDB, views are not included. It's exactly what Toon said at the start. It's a set of PL/SQL subprograms.
However, if I was now to embark upon a large Apex project, I think I would allow some SQL from Apex into the database, because it's not practical from Apex to do everything using stored procedure APIs. It's simply just not practical. That's the issue with these tools.
Yes, of course. And that would be a deliberate compromise or a deliberate decision, and you wouldn't then claim that the approach was SmartDB.
Correct. Yeah.
It would be what it is. It would be, let's say, possibly an insistence that a PL/SQL subprogram approach is used for all the data changing operations. Maybe not even that, but definitely as far as query operations are concerned, you would allow the native functionality of Apex, which encourages high productivity, to be used at sacrificing the principle of the subprogram.
I would try to push as much logic out of Apex into a view or into a table function, which you then select from, because that only benefits maintenance and possibly moving on to some different technology in the future. Good.
Well, that seems to be clear so far. So let's see if there are any other questions. We've got about 15 minutes left so far. Questions or comments?
It's Jacek. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes. Very well.
First of all, thanks for this presentation. It's very good to hear and see you talk about things that I kind of try to use every day in my day-to-day work. However, on the XAPIs and crude PL/SQL, I have few questions. So first of all, transaction control. When we talk about multiple layers, so you have your, let's say, base crude APIs, and then on top of that you build your XAPIs, and they are accessed from multiple consumers or different consumers. Might be Apex, might be some other UI, might be middle tier.
Mm-hmm.
Where would you put transaction control? And if you have, sorry for a long question, but just to give a broader context, if those table APIs might also be exposed to be used individually by consumers. So let's say you have a blend of SmartDB APIs, which are business rules. They are encapsulating or using the crude APIs, and those crude APIs are also being exposed. Or would you consider this an overcomplicated architecture, or what would you suggest in this kind of scenario where you need both crude access and business logic, as with this depth-empt example?
Well, let me have a go first, and then Toon can fill in the bits I say badly. First of all, this question of reuse. And by the way, this echoes very much a tweet storm that took place, I don't know, last fall sometime, where the general topic was someone said, never commit in PL SQL as a kind of hard and fast rule. And I reacted, strongly against that. In this talk that Toon referred to, the hard shell thing, then I'm encouraging that that one thinks very, very clearly about the role of the subprograms that implement the API. It's a very deliberate design choice. This is the set. They've got the names they've got the functionality they've got, and they are responsible for doing what they're supposed to be doing. And for ease of organization, they would all be singleton functions or procedures. In other words, the sole item in a package, all in a dedicated schema. But that's not the main point here. The main point here is simply that you've got a particular set of them that came into being very much because they're exactly and only what you needed. So far, there's no exact notion of reuse, except that, by all means, if you see an opportunity for it, there might be one or several TAPIs under that lot that are involved in the implementation of two or more of these business functions. Now, where's the future reuse? Well, suppose some brand new function comes to light and you haven't implemented it yet, and you see that it would be proper to do so. Well, then that would be the n+1th subprogram in the already understood concept of SmartDB, and then you would just go about implementing it in the ordinary way. And if you found that you were going to make use of some pre-existing subprograms within the world behind the hard shell that were not exposed as part of the hard shell's API, well, be my guest. There's nothing controversial there. Now, there's an implicit question here. It's, would it be okay to elevate the TAPI to the status of a XAPI? And then the question is a bit subtle. Let me hold that on the stack and just say something that I believe I forgot to say. That is the following. Clearly, commit has to happen somewhere. And my belief is that, except in arcane situations of distributed transaction, which perhaps we'll have to come back to, the commit should definitely be in the database. Why? Because it's that story of responsibility needs authority. If you're responsible for making a certain change within the set of persisted facts in the database, then you must be responsible for doing it, including committing. If you pass on the commit to client-side code, they may or may not remember to do it, and who knows where they stand. The authority has been shared between inappropriate components. Now, where is the commit going to happen? Exactly and only in each of the XAPI subprograms. If we're now using XAPI to mean ones that make changes and QAPI to mean ones that don't, then clearly every single XAPI subprogram must have, as its very last ordinary action, a commit. And then there'd be a further discussion about what to do in the case of errors and error logging and so on and so on and so on. But for the time being, let's leave that aside. That's where the commit is. So now back to the reuse of a TAPI. If you suddenly decide that some TAPI that's there involved in several things under the covers, by some miraculous good luck, fulfills a previously unthought of business requirement, well, it, by virtue of what I just said, won't have a commit in it. You mustn't put a commit in it to elevate it to a XAPI. All you need is a trivial wrapper around that exposes it, if that suits your purposes. Did that all make sense?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Yes. I guess I should move on to distributed transactions, just because it was Stu Ashton. I forgot to tweet him about this, and I don't think he's here. He said something about that. My immediate reaction is that we can't talk about everything while we're talking about general good principles, and the whole world of distributed transactions is a bit complicated and outside of our scope. But loosely speaking, if you had a XAPI that was part of a distributed transaction and you needed some, central XA kind of way of doing your commit, Well, under those circumstances, something of what I said would just have to be sadly weakened, and the responsibility for commit would be taken away from the XAPI subprograms and done elsewhere. I can't think of any alternative to that, but it's a risky, dangerous world to be in, I have to say that. Do you have any comments on that, Toon?
Yeah, maybe a few. So I fully agree that with the business function API, it has the responsibility to commit and or rollback in case of an error. And you have to keep in mind also that nowadays we have with web applications, you go to the back end, you get something done, and you get control back in the front end, be it via a full HTTP post or via silent REST calls happening under the covers. But at some point, all these calls into the database go via a session pool on the middle tier. There's always a session pool on the middle tier, and the session pool enables the connections into this empty connect schema. So, and these sessions, they are shared all the time between all the calls that are coming in on the middle tier. So once you're inside the middle tier and you have a session of the session pool and you go into the database, you have to leave the database fully committed or fully rollbacked. Otherwise, you're going to leave an open transaction inside that session of the session pool. Now, so then going to your TAPI question, when you expose TAPIs, I sense that there could be a sequence of TAPI calls. Well, but then again, if that's not the case, then just put a stub on top of the TAPI, which is the business function API and which has to commit again. But you cannot do a sequence of TAPIs over multiple calls to the backend. I hope that's clear given the architecture of today's applications. But if you do have the need to do multiple TAPIs across the going back and forth from the browser to the backend, well then there's no other option but to commit per TAPI call, which may leave the database in a state, because you need all the 3 TAPI calls to be done, and nothing happens after the first TAPI call. It may leave the database in a state that you do not want. Yeah. So if you have a sequence of TAPI calls going via multiple requests, be aware they could all happen in different sessions from the connection pool, and you have to finish each call into the database with either a commit or a rollback. That's the only thing that I would like to add to this.
Okay, thank you. Just on that, the commit, rollback, and connection pool, that brings me one more thing, which might be a bit exciting off topic, but just if that's true, that don't answer. I guess, it's not just about the transaction control, but whole session state in the connection pool. Whatever you're setting or using or within the session, let's say whether it's either virtual database, VPD context, or anything else that's like package states, right?
Yes.
Probably you need to make sure that it's being cleared.
Yes.
Whenever you're doing using collection pool.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Absolutely true. I think I have 2 explicit slides on this topic in the talks that I did, and they're in the YouTube video also. But it's exactly the kind of things that you mentioned. If you have altered NLS settings, or use $v context application context state, or use persistent package variables, all those kinds of stuff you would have to clean up before you exit the database and go back to the front end again. And typically you don't leave cursors open either, which, by the way, forget that. PL/SQL takes care of that. If you use static cursors.
So in the interest of covering a bit more, I'm going to pick a question now, because I can, from the chat list. It's from Nico, and it says, what does your QAPI look like? What does the query API look like? Do you advocate views or PL/SQL table functions or something else? Well, as far as the last part of the question is concerned, I think we've hammered that to death. What we're recommending is a subprogram who takes all the parameters that determine the desired query result then an implementation under the covers, and then a return, which is exactly the report that you wanted. It could be, of course, a master detail report as an example, and conceptually, that is a single record with some scalar fields who are the properties of interest of the master, and then a field which is itself if this was PL SQL vocabulary, it would be an index by PLS integer table of record, where the records now are the records that have the facts of interest about the details. So it's perfectly possible to parameterize the request for a particular query and to find a way to represent the result. And of course, you can see how that would be taken over into the world of JSON without thinking hard about it. It's basically the same semantics in a different representation. Now, the question is, how do you implement such a QAPI? And the brute force and sad answer is you just type it up, whatever it takes. But if you do type it up, whatever it takes, then you have the choice, knowing the larger things you know about the general volumes of data and that kind of thing. You have the choice between doing under the covers, a single select from a join of the tables, and then in procedural code doing what they used to call break on, or the equivalent of that in SQL+, arranging it so it looks more palatable to look at. Or if you think the performance is not so critical here and tests have shown it and you want to write very clear code, you could simply select the master, and then having got that and got its presumably surrogate key, you could select the details that link to that surrogate key in two separate queries. I'm not trying to recommend one approach over the other. I'm just trying to say that in the most banal way of doing this, the programmer who understands everything about Oracle database very well will just choose an appropriate way and type it up. And in a lot of cases, this isn't too hard. But this does take us, teetering towards the world of generation. If you have a famous example is a single table query with 10 columns, and you want to express a predicate against each of the columns, and the predicate could be numeric, it could be date, it could be text, and you want some wildcard thing in the text, and on and on and on and on. There are different ways of approaching that and different kinds of discussion about it. And I'm sure that some people would work out that they'd found some generality, in their particular application, and that would be an opportunity for generation. But long story short, whether or not you generate it or type it by hand, you're going to end up with an ordinary PL SQL implementation, which is an encapsulation around one or several queries, who gets stuff back, having expressed the appropriate restrictions, and then formats it in some way into the at least the semantic idea of what is required to show at the UI. I hope that made sense.